Hi there. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics. That's EQ, emotional intelligence. I'm actually going to do a 4-part series on EQ, emotional intelligence. As you may know, this is a very powerful tool, very powerful part of us. We often hear about IQ. Often we're tested for IQ to get into certain schools, or sometimes people in general are tested for IQ in institutional settings to better understand people from an intellect perspective. How do they think? How do they work? Well, EQ is just as important, and in some contexts, by far more important, especially as you get into higher roles, you get into greater leadership responsibility. EQ then becomes more important. And what does that emotional intelligence mean? For some people, it sounds a little soft and fuzzy because you don't see this number tied to it. But just because something doesn't have a number tied to it does not mean that it's not equally or more important in some contexts. So let's talk about a little bit of the background just to give credit where credit is due. Daniel Goleman is the godfather, father, if you will, of the whole EQ concept. Travis Bradberry has done a significant amount of work in the contemporary setting of EQ. So the 4 parts we're going to focus on. Firstly, today is self-awareness, which is the first part of EQ. Then we will get into self-management. Then we'll get into social awareness, and then relationship management. So today we're only going to cover specifically self-awareness because that is so much in and of itself. I will tell you, I've coached many people, and that is the hardest hurdle. Not only is it the hardest hurdle, but is the prerequisite of any other subsequent growth. It's impossible for you to grow from where you are if you do not totally know where you are. That makes sense. Because in order to build a transition, to build a bridge on that gap that exists, you have to know the size of that gap and what road you're going to travel. For example, if you're trying to go from New York to Oklahoma and you have no idea of the types of roads that you're tackling, you may not know whether or not you need to take a train or take a boat or take a bus or drive a car. You know, obviously, most of us are just jumping on planes and not thinking about it. But the whole point that I'm making is if you're making distance, you need to know how to navigate that distance. So what is self-awareness? It's just like it's described, but it's not as easy to master as it is to understand the definition. So the definition of itself is being aware of yourself. What does that mean? That means you know how you respond in situations. You know how you feel in situations. And sometimes that may sound very obvious, but sometimes it's not so obvious. For example, you might be around certain people who are triggers for you. They might use language that you're uncomfortable with, or they may speak a certain way that is off-putting, or they just might move at a pace that is slower than you prefer or faster than you prefer. Whatever reason, there may be triggers around you that may make you feel a certain way. And those aren't always bad. Sometimes people may say or do something that make us feel absolutely fantastic, energize us. Then other times someone may say or do something that sort of zaps your energy, or it might even make you angry, right? And so that self-awareness is knowing, how do you feel in that moment? You know, it's easy for us to sometimes ignore our feelings because we have things to do, quite frankly. So we don't want to sit around and wallow in our feelings because we want to get from A to B, get things done. But the challenge is it's important for us to be aware of ourselves in order to graduate to that next step of managing ourselves. Like, we can't manage something that we don't know. So sometimes if we're not self-aware, we may have, say, for example, a funny look on our face when somebody says something the wrong way or does something wrongly. We may have this awkward look, or we might look upset and somebody might say, why do you look so upset? And you might say, well, I'm not upset. And you might, if you're not self-aware, you may actually be upset and other people can see it, but you can't see it. And sometimes it even goes further to the point of where you might be saying something a certain way and people don't realize, or you don't realize that you're saying it a certain way because you don't realize that you're offended by the person that you're with, or or the situation that you're in. So that self-awareness piece is very, very important. So how can you master self-awareness? First and foremost, it's about giving yourself permission to feel. How do you feel in this moment? That's the first step of mastering self-awareness. And that may sound simple, but a lot of us don't give ourselves permission to feel. We say, we're older, we're supposed to suck things up and move on. So when we don't give ourselves permission to feel, which is the first step of being aware of ourselves, we're going to deny those feelings that might creep in that we don't approve of, whether it's fear, I'm afraid of doing this because it's something new. I'm afraid of this new challenge. Well, and that might be uncomfortable for someone to admit that they're afraid. So instead of admitting it, and acknowledging it, they might deny it even to themselves. So the first step is realizing that there is no wrong in any emotion. It's about how we are handling the emotions, how we're choosing to respond to the emotions. But in the emotion itself is not wrong at all. And so that is the first step. The second step is, learning to understand, well, what am I going to do with my discomfort? Well, first of all, we recognize the first step is acknowledging it. Okay, we acknowledge it's there, and what do we do with it? So we want to address it by processing it. And that's different for different people. For some people, it's talking to someone. For others, it may be journaling. For someone else, they may need to walk it out, to breathe, to have breathing exercises if it's an uncomfortable emotion. But you do have to take that second step beyond the acknowledging and learning, how do I address that discomfort? If you're working, for example, and you're going from one meeting to the next, and you know that there may be, difficult to deal with people in certain meetings, well, you might need to carve out a buffer of time in between to give yourself time to breathe and relax in between those meetings so that you are able to deal with those discomforts that happen to you when you're in trigger environments. And then other ways that are very important is by monitoring yourself, paying more attention to yourself. Not saying that you're going to be paranoid to yourself in every second, but, making it that habit of paying attention to yourself can go a really long way in interacting with others, as well as just paying attention to yourself in general. How are you feeling? Is your breathing changing? How do you feel differently in one context to another, or around one person to another? These are all really important ways. And then, one last way I would want to mention about managing self-awareness is really bringing in someone else. I always call it, when I coach people, an accountability partner. It's important for you to have someone who you trust their perspective. And you can have multiple accountability partners. So you might have at work an accountability partner who's in a lot of meetings with you, or, and then when you leave work, your spouse might be an accountability partner, or a close friend might be an accountability partner. These individuals generally have two very important components. One, they have your trust. You trust them. You trust that they have your best interests in mind. And two, you can trust that they're going to tell you the truth. They're not going to be afraid to be candid to you for whatever reason. They're going to give you that direct feedback, that direct perspective. And that feedback is, how are you showing up? Are you wearing your emotions, or are you able to handle uncomfortable situations in a way that is graceful? And they can also tell you what growth you're making in that progress as well, or with that progress as well. So those are the main areas of self-awareness. And next time I look forward to talking more. We've already started talking a little bit more about self-management, but we'll get into that in the next video. But I hope you take that time this week to just focus on being more aware of yourself, giving yourself permission to feel what you're going to feel, and identifying, what does that look like? How does that feel? a great day.